$50, $60, $100, $170.
That is how much you can spend on a tent footprint. The question is, do you even need it?
Well, it depends on who you talk to. Some very experienced and reputable experts insist you need a tent footprint to protect your expensive tent from dirt, debris, abrasion, and more.
I, on the other hand, have never really seen the point, but I do understand why you would want one.
Your tent is an investment that you want to last as long as possible. A footprint is like cheap insurance, or at least that's the idea. What I want to know is how big of a difference does a thin single layer of material really make? Is it worth the time, money, and weight, or is it just an upsell to make brands more money?
To find out, I came up with 4 different tests to put numbers behind the claims and find out once and for all.
But first, what even is a footprint and what is it for? Footprints are really simple. It's just an extra layer of material that goes between your tent and the ground, and in general, people claim they do 4 main things. A footprint is supposed to protect against accidental puncture, protect against excessive abrasion, increase waterproofing, and some say it even reduces condensation inside your tent by creating a vapor barrier. That last one is the hardest one for me to believe, so I set up 2 identical tents, one with a footprint, one without. I slept in one while my buddy Clint slept in the other.
This is my buddy Clint. He's got a YouTube channel too. Go check him out, The Not Lost Nomad.
Yeah, I love hiking, backpacking. Come check it out.
We slept in the tent simultaneously for the same amount of time, and then in the morning we weighed the flies to see which one, if any, had more condensation.
But before we go there, let's start a little simpler with puncture resistance.
I have here a simple little force meter with a broken twig. To puncture a single layer tent floor fabric, it takes an average of 13 pounds of force. If I double up that fabric like you would if you had a tent footprint underneath, it takes an average of 30 pounds of force. And if I'm being honest, this makes sense. You double up the material, you're essentially making the tent floor twice as strong. But personally, and you're gonna see my bias here, I think it's just as easy to look before you set up your tent and remove any rocks, sticks, or other objects before you set your tent down. It's the next test that I'm really interested in.
Okay, so 2 layers of fabric does increase puncture resistance, but can it increase waterproofness? Well, to answer that question, we have to talk about what constitutes a waterproof piece of material.
Waterproofness is calculated in measurements of hydrostatic head. The idea is if you take a column of water and stack it on top of the fabric, how high would it need to be before it created enough pressure to penetrate the fabric's waterproof coating? A fabric that has a hydrostatic head rating of 10,000 means if you place a column of water 10,000 millimeters high on the fabric, it still wouldn't leak.
In the past, hydrostatic head was measured using actual columns of water, but today's fabrics have such high ratings that finding the physical space to stack 30,000 millimeters or about 100 feet of water on top of a piece of fabric is just unrealistic.
So machines like this have been developed to mimic the pressures created by really tall columns of water.
But I don't have one of those machines, so I took a page out of the Fortnite playbook and I made this.
Basically, I fill this pipe with water, clamp the material over the end, and pressurize it with air. The amount of air pressure it takes to force water through the fabric can be converted into hydrostatic head.
1 layer cut from the floor of my donor tent peaks at about 20 psi. That's roughly equivalent to 14,000 millimeters of hydrostatic head.
If I double up those layers, you can see that the water penetrates the first layer around 20 psi, just like we would expect. And then a few seconds later, at just 22 psi, water begins penetrating the second layer of fabric. That's not even a 10% increase in performance.
So not only do footprints barely increase waterproofing, your tent floor is already doing better than you really need it to.
The most force your tent is realistically going to see is about 8 psi. That is how much force the average man exerts with all their weight on 1 foot. With a single layer of this cheap Amazon tent testing at almost 20 psi, that means I'd have to run over the tent floor with my car to create enough pressure to force water through the floor. Bumping that up to 22 psi gives you a little bit better performance, but do you really need it?
So even cheap tents are designed to put up with more than you can dish out without a footprint, but maybe years and years of wear and tear weakens the material, reducing puncture resistance and hydrostatic head.
To find out, I built this to mimic and speed up the abrasion you would normally get after years of using your tent.
But before we get into that, have you noticed anything different about me?
New glasses?
You're exactly right, Homer. I've got some new glasses thanks to today's sponsor, SportRx.
SportRx isn't just another online glasses company. They specifically cater to people who want to be outdoors.
There's a lot of things I could say about them. them, like how they'll work with you one-on-one to help you find the right pair of glasses and sunglasses specifically suited to the outdoor activity that you're interested in, or how they helped me find my very first pair of progressive lenses, because I'm not getting any younger. But because we're in a testing mood, I wanted to do a couple of real quick tests of these glasses, comparing them to an older, cheaper pair of glasses I no longer use.
One of the options you can get on any Sport RX glasses is an anti-glare coating that helps reduce glares that cause eye strain. I wanted to see if I could measure this, so I set up both my new Sport RX glasses and a cheap pair I no longer use in front of my camera, and I shined a light until I could produce a glare in both glasses. I then pulled that into my editing software and measure the light levels on the glare itself.
When I isolate those glares and measure their luminance, there's almost a 50% difference between the cheap glasses and the Sport RX glasses with anti-glare. And that's just one of the things I could easily test on these Sport RX glasses. They got so many more options, like anti-scratch coatings, anti-fog coatings. They've even got prescription sunglasses that allow you to see more definition in the shadows, which really help on hikes where you're hiking in and out of tree coverage. Go check them out at sportrx.com or through the links in the description.
According to the internet, the average person moves between 10 and 30 times in the night. We will split that in half and go with 20. If we can assume that every time you move, you're rubbing your tent on the ground approximately 4 times, that means your average night in a tent rubs your tent against the ground 80 times. By slowing down the video, I can count how many frames it takes for the sander to make one movement. Multiply that by the frame rate and you get 80 movements every 8 seconds, or 8 seconds is equal to 1 night in the average tent. I started off with 2.5 minutes, roughly equal to 20 nights in a tent, then tested the tent and found less than a 20% reduction in hydrostatic head and no reduction in puncture resistance on the tent with no footprint. I repeated this process with 40, 60, and 80 nights in a tent, and then pushed it all the way to 160 nights in a tent. And I saw about the same reduction both with and without a footprint until we got to 60 nights in a tent, when the tent without a footprint dropped all the way down to just 10 psi and then stayed there all the way through 160 nights in a tent. And this is where it gets interesting, because even though the tent without a footprint did seem to decline a little faster, the footprint eventually ended up in the exact same place, bottoming out at 10 psi by 160 nights in a tent.
And according to this survey on my community tab, most people spend less than 5 nights a year in a tent. That means you could easily get 4 to 8 or even more nights in a tent without a footprint before you ever saw a significant decrease in performance.
But maybe it's not about that. Maybe it's just peace of mind that your expensive tent is worth the extra time, weight, and money. And if that's you, then there's no judgment here. You don't even have to spend big money on a footprint. There are multiple videos out there that will show you how to make inexpensive footprints with commonly available materials. If you're interested, I'll put a couple of links in the description. But what about that last claim of reducing condensation? Well, after 2 nights in the tent, one with and one without a footprint, there isn't a big difference. On night 1, there was no difference in condensation, and on night 2, we saw less than 3 ounces of difference, and the tent with a footprint actually had more condensation, which seems pretty conclusive to me. A footprint doesn't help with condensation any at all. So for me personally, I haven't seen any numbers that make me want to change my mind when it comes to footprints. Do they help with abrasion, puncture resistance, and waterproofness? Yes, but not in any significant way that makes a big difference in my mind. But what about you? Let me know in the comments below. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like, subscribe, and do all those other things. And as always, thanks for watching.
So 2 layers does increase puncture resistance, but can it increase waterproofness? Well, maybe.